Germany. Indeed, in the end, something like the big challenges of our times for any country, but in that special research project, we wanted to dig deeper into what this all means for Germany and for the German model, and that made, and in the end, we had the idea to make a whole workshop and to present each of these studies. So we had a study, the second phase of a study of a research project on inequality, where we, in the first phase, that's what we presented last year, tried to have an empirical update on what is the state, because it's not so easy, the statistics aren't easy, of inequality in Germany. The second state was what we have presented, and Charlotte Martels has presented yesterday, on the drivers of inequality in Germany, because for our project in this 3 steps, this is the important one, to understand where inequality comes from, and in this third phase, then be better able to define what are the best and most efficient instruments to get against inequality. We had a discussion about industrial policy, which is very much linked to the challenge of climate change and anyway the change of industrial structures in Germany, which may hit Germany especially, and where we had an excellent study done by the team of Mariana Mazzucato on industrial policy. We have had a study by Michael Hüter and Jens Südekom on fiscal policy, questioning the current rules and proposing some new ideas for reform of the debt brake to better cope with underinvestment, public investment, and difficulties of municipalities. And we had a study presented on the German export surplus, which is more or less the question of how can Germany become an economy that is less dependent on exports in a way. That was the core of the studies that we have presented, and then we had some excellent contributions. We had a more political day on Monday with interventions of the SPD, had Robert Walter Boyans, a political panel with also Dalia Marin with an excellent presentation on also the let's say the experience of Germany after unification and what that means for the reform of capitalism. And we had to talk with Jens Spahn, the German Minister of Health. Yesterday there was another talk, a keynote by Thomas Piketty on the German ideology and the renovation of Europe, with an excellent discussion afterwards on that we may come back to later this morning when we are talking about Germany's future role in the Eurozone. And we had yesterday in the afternoon another highlight at the end with a talk between Joe Stieglitz and Olaf Scholz, German Minister of Finance, who yesterday just had introduced his budget plans in the Bundestag. And I mean, having taken the time to come and discuss with Joe Stieglitz is something I think we should appreciate, whatever we think about what he said. But it was a nice talk. I mean, Joe was friendly, I think, that's for sure. But maybe also due to the fact that even Joe Stieglitz is not does not have all the days the opportunity to talk to a current Minister of Finance of such a big country, or important country like Germany. I think in the end, we have a lot of people from different boards, and I think I don't want to construct whatever consensus, but I think there's something like a dynamic understanding that there are some big challenges for Germany, and there is a need to find new solutions. That's what our project is about, to search to help and search for a new paradigm, and to see what are the new answers. And anyway, in the discussions, we see that it's a new kind of a discussion. That's what I'm very proud of, that we avoid the old economic debates and battles. And I want it, and that's what I think we succeeded in doing, to be very productive on new ideas, like on inequality, where it's a lot about understanding what's happening. And that leads to our today third day and a half day that we have, and with another couple of highlights, where now we want to discuss on the future, let's say, the future of the German model in under the with the question of populism, which is, I mean, in a way, touching everything that we had yesterday, because depending, and that's something we want to discuss in this panel, on the interpretation of the reasons for populism, there are indications that it's also at least linked to socioeconomic factors, that a lot of what's happening in industries has contributed, the disruptions in industries like in the US, in the Rust Belt and so on, has contributed to populism. And that this is an important link, and that for us, the question of the future of, let's say, the prospects of populism and in Germany, AfD, is very much also a question of how the German model will evolve. We don't, hopefully, we don't want, and we hopefully won't have something like the debate in the US yesterday in a year or so, or 4 years then. But the question is open. I mean, populism has also hit Germany, and the AfD has been strong for some time. This year, the big news is maybe in that sense that the Corona crisis doesn't seem have helped populists in any country, but also in Germany, if you look at the polls for the AfD. So one of the leading questions now is the time over? Is the time for populism over, at least for Germany? There has been a study recently published by, I think, Bertelsmann and others, saying that in polls you see less populist attitudes by Germans than some time ago. Is that for real? Is that something which we can count on, or will there be another wave, or may there be another wave of populism? This is very much linked to the. I mean, the answer is very much linked to the fundamental analysis we are having for what is the reason for populism. So I want to kick off this discussion saying that we are having two other highlights this morning: a presentation on the ups and downs of buzzwords, neoliberal, market liberal buzzwords in Germany. That's very exciting. You should have a look at that. And then an excellent, huge session on the future role of Germany in the Eurozone, with people like Clemens Fuß, Martin Wolf, and moderated by Mark Schieritz from Die Zeit. So stay tuned then afterwards. But now let's kick off. I want to ask Robert to kick off, because you've been doing a lot of academic work on the reasons, on the drivers of populism internationally, but also in Germany. What is your latest understanding of what's happening? And maybe also a first element to answer the question is populism over? Will there be another? May there be another wave in the run up to the next year's elections in Germany?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I always refrain a little bit from looking at populism in Germany in isolation. So I'm very much used to looking at populism in Germany as part of a European trend, or you could even count the US in. And there you see that over the last decade or so, we have an increasing trend towards populist support in many countries. And I think the studies around that have looked into the reasons for that, they came up with a variety of drivers of that, of course, but one consistent picture is that economic shocks and the inequalities that result from global economic developments, increasing international trade, automatization, also the financial crisis have contributed to the rise of populism. Specifically, they have increased the demand for protectionist and nationalist policies. And what we see is that specifically right-wing populist parties very successfully tap into this vote potential. And in Germany, it's the AfD that have tapped into this potential. Indeed, I think that, let me, as long as these inequalities persist, as long as there's losers from international economic developments, there's a voting potential for parties that offer nationalist, isolationist, or protectionist policies. Whether this is populist parties, like in Central Europe, or whether that is a mainstream party, like in the UK, the Tories, in the end doesn't matter. What the core issue is this voting potential. And this is there to persist as long as these inequalities persist. If you ask me about Germany concretely, I think what's a little bit specific is two things. The one is that in international comparison, Germany has always been a winner of globalization, and thus we have been a relative latecomer in this populist movement. And I think this is partly also due to the German economic model, with a relatively strong welfare state, with as compared to Anglo-Saxon countries, rather interventionist policies, but also from our export orientation, where many people benefit from the global development. And the AfD grew strong on an anti-immigration platform. That's pretty obvious. And the AfD has not managed to broaden its scope or to develop a consistent agenda beyond that. And with the Corona crisis, the migration topic has lost its prominence. And I think you also see that populists in power don't perform that well. So I do indeed think that the high times of the AfD might be over, as long as they do not manage to bring this migration topic up again. But it's different in many other European countries, where populism has transcended into the mainstream, and where more policy areas are discussed in this populist way, with ignorance of facts and on the basis of ideological issues. And thus, I think, even if the AfD loses support in the next general election, first, the voting potential for nationalist policy approaches persist, as long as the underlying economic fundamentals persist. And an economic model like the German economic model, that strongly rests on an open economy and is grounded in the European Union, cannot successfully develop if this European trend persists. So we don't gain much if the AfD loses ground, but this populist rhetorics persists in other European countries, because I think this very way, we saw this yesterday in the debate in the US, this very way of doing politics, the populist way, erodes the basis for international cooperation. And thus, I think even in Germany, we must not focus on the AfD and the populists in Germany only. It's a European phenomenon, and voting in other countries also matters for us. This is what I wanted to say here.
Thank you, Robert. I hand over to Anke Hassel, who's leading the WSI. You've done a lot of research on these issues also, so please, what is your take on the prospects of populism, and especially the German situation currently and the next few months?
Yes, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, first of all, for inviting me here to this panel and for this great conference you put up. I think it is outstanding. Your program is really outstanding. When it comes to the future of populism in Germany, under the impact of the pandemic, you have already correctly described that the AfD is not doing so well in the polls. and that this might give us hope that the height of populism in Germany is actually over. I would not be so optimistic, and I would not share this analysis, and for the same reason as Robert has just said, that the fundamentals, the underlying fundamentals, the conflicts on which populism thrives, these conflicts have not been resolved. And one could even turn it around and say what we will see in the course of the pandemic and in the economic impact, the long-term economic impact of the pandemic and of other aspects of structural change on the German economy might lead to more economic insecurities, to more social inequalities, which might drive more populist fears in the population and therefore give more voting potential for the far right. And if we look at what is happening now, we have the combination, the coincidence of the pandemic in a situation where the German manufacturing sector was already under pressure and in a lot of stress. And if we look at how many people are on short-term work, in Germany, we see it is not actually the service economy which is hit hardest or which uses short-term work the most. We see that it is the manufacturing sector in the previously relatively affluent areas of Germany, which is using a lot of short-time work, which means they are shielding their workers from layoffs, which they would otherwise have to implement. And these layoffs are only partly to do with the pandemic. These layoffs are to do with climate change. They are to do with the decline of the combustion engine, with the restructuring in many areas of the manufacturing industries. And what we do know today already is that a lot of these jobs will be lost. And these are relatively highly paid jobs in the manufacturing sectors in areas where people thought they were protected from structural change and economic change. And this goes hand in hand with more economic insecurity, and this will feed into an expectation of people that the government should do something in order to protect them, and if the government does not deliver the protection, this will lead to more frustration and might lead to a new rise in populism just on socioeconomic grounds. So I think in the medium to long term, we might have more worries to worry about voting potential for the far right. And similarly, we can also say that for more issues of identity politics, for diverse and open societies, because again, here we have a coincidence of the pandemic on one hand, and at the same time, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have anti-racism debate, we have a lot of debate about diversity in German society. We have now for the first time after, maybe not for the first time, but now we have after 30 years of German reunification, we have a much more substantial debate about socioeconomic inequalities between East Germans and West Germans. We know that East Germans have far fewer assets than compared to West Germans. We know that their incomes are still not equal compared to West Germans. So we have a lot of reasons where it might get more social conflicts between regions, but also between different groups in society, which then might feed again the voting potential for the far right, because the white male lower middle classes might feel threatened by a further discussion about anti-racism, a further discussion about anti-discrimination, and might look for political alternatives in order to deal with that. And the third aspect, which I also want to bring into the mix, is really the political aspect. So we are 1 year ahead of a German general election. We have on the left, we have Olaf Scholz as a chancellor candidate of the SPD. But on the side of the CDU, there is a lot of confusion still, and we do not know who will replace Angela Merkel. I think it is a safe bet that the CDU will come out as the winning party out of the election, but we do not know who will lead Angela Merkel. And we have seen in recent polls that people are really undecided on who they will vote for, if depending on who will succeed Angela Merkel. And that can create a lot of political instability and political insecurity. And people might abstain, or people might go for alternatives for which they, at the moment, in the current situations, not opt for. So I think there are a lot of underlying reasons why we should worry about the far right, even in Germany, even though we know that comparatively speaking, in the European context, but in particular also in context compared to the United States, populism is now at the moment not our main concern, but I think we should still take it seriously and expect there will be more to come in the future, in the next 12 months, that we have to take care of. So finally, when we deal with populism, and the question is always, how do we deal with populism? I think we need to distinguish between the voters' potential and the people who are worried for socioeconomic reasons, but also for cultural and identity reasons, but also for political reasons, and how we should distinguish those, the voters, from the party, the AfD, and we should have separate approaches how we deal with the AfD on the one hand and how we deal with voters on the other hand. And this debate has already been happening over the last couple of years, that people have said we really have to take worry seriously. We have to have policies, industrial policy, employment policy, structural change policies in order to help people who fear of losing their jobs in structural change. We have to address socioeconomic inequalities to help those people. And we also have to embrace, in a discussion about the open society, about diversity, how can we deal with diversity and how can we deal with anti-discrimination and the fear of losing out. I think we have to have very clear policies on these issues. But we also have to have very clear policies on the AfD, because if you look at what the political science literature sort of says about populism, and if you look at books like the book, for instance, by Daniel Sieblatt and Levitsky about how democracies die, we know from research is that democracies die when centrist parties start operating or tacitly supporting or at least tolerating the far right getting into power positions in political systems. And we also know that as soon as the far right is in a power position, they will start changing the institutions, eroding the institutions, ignoring the institutions, and ignoring the rule of law. And that is what is happening in Hungary and Poland, but it's also to some extent happening in the United States and a little bit in the United Kingdom. So I think there we also need to have a very clear position and a very clear approach that it is absolutely fundamental that centrist parties, center-right and center-left, do not start cooperating and tolerating the far-right when they try to get into power positions. And that we have seen that over the last 12 months in a number of cases. And I think it is absolutely essential that we make this position very clear.
Thank you very much, Anke. Very clear, very Gustav Horn, who has been director and founder of the EMK Institute in Düsseldorf, and now advising the SPD, and especially having written and published a book very recently on the reasons for post-populism, right-wing populism, post-populism, which is called Gegensteuern. The title of the book, which is very inspiring. So you're a very good place. You've thought a lot about this question. Is your take more or less the same as the others? First, perhaps on the diagnosis and the prospects of populism in Germany.
First of all, thank you for having me here at this really outstanding conference. I looked at the program and learned a lot. So what about populism? I think populism is a sort of pandemic. As we have heard by Robert already, it's infectious. If populism spreads in one country and, for example, protectionist policies are applied there, certainly other countries have to react on that and probably apply the same measures. So we have a kind of infection here. But there are times when you are more resilient against these infections and times where you're more weak. At the moment, I think at this time, we are more resilient against it because we're still in a deep crisis caused by the pandemic, and the government is doing a lot to protect people against the economic impacts of that crisis. And people feel that, and the approval ratings of government are pretty high, much higher than they were before. But at the times, and that's what Anke and Robert already said, this crisis is over. It really depends what happens next. And for example, if the debate shifts to the topic, who will pay for all this debt burden we are uploading right now, then we have a debate which might cause fear by some people. And this is a key word in all, at the root of the populism. It's fear. The roots of the AfD, for example, was not an anti-migrant policy, but rather an anti-euro policy at the times of the euro crisis, where the euro became very insecure and the construction of the eurozone became very insecure. That was the time when the AfD was founded by an economist, by the way. And that was the first step of the AfD. Then came anti-migranism, and it shifted to the climate change. And as I like to add in political in the political scenery, I say, and then there came the wolves to my region of Brandenburg, and they also caused fear. And that's all topics with fear, connect with fear, where these populists are certainly, which is a very beneficiary environment for populists, because it's not only that they address the losers of change, they address all people who are afraid of change. And because we have not a very weak correlation between income and voting behavior, but it's rather that people are afraid of losing control of their lives. And they still have a very decent income, even sometimes a high income. Nevertheless, they vote for the populist. And we see that in the United States, we have seen that in Germany too. But there is fear in these people, and the fear of losing control of their lives, of their economic performance, and so on. And that has to be addressed by politics. And Anke already mentioned a lot of fields of politics which are necessary which have to address these issues. We have to give people good reasons to see that the government is doing something for them, to protect them for adverse impacts, for example, of this pandemic. That's exactly what's happening right now. But also we have to do that after this crisis. And for example, this speaks strongly against the policy of austerity to reduce the debt burden after the crisis. Because in that case, for example, with cuts in the social system, we will certainly raise this fear again, and that will raise populism again. And also it certainly will be a very important debate, who is going to pay for all the interest burden which has been rising up? And will we reintroduce a wealth tax, for example? Will we increase heritage tax? Or will we just cut into the social system? And these are very decisive questions. If the latter happens, I'm absolutely convinced that populism in Germany will rise again, and in other countries too, and maybe in a kind of different institutional setting. What we have seen in recent months already is that the AfD is trying at least to expand their base towards people who were very skeptical towards this crisis right from the beginning here. Anti-vaccination people and so on, people who from the beginning said that the virus is not very dangerous. It's an imagination of Bill Gates to produce vaccines and so on. All this stuff will come up. Maybe there are new coalitions in the making, and that certainly we have to take care of, and policy has to take care of in the next year or two.
Thank you very much, Gustav. So I think we need to diagnose that to do the diagnosis that we have a panel that is not very much in disaccord on fundamental question, but I don't think that it's a big problem, because when you want to discuss in a productive and constructive way, it's not all helpful to have very diverging views. And I think we have a lot of questions that are interesting in deeper terms. But I would like to ask Robert, we all seem to share this this diagnosis that there's something about fear, loss of control, socioeconomic factors, disruptions that explains, and that's what I understand from your research. But very openly, and you're an academic, you need to be very neutral. How is the state of academic research? In political debates, you always find people who say, well, finally, it's not economic, it's in its culture. So could you give us an idea how disputed this question still is? It's a quite recent research field in academics.
Well, sure. I mean, there's a, well, how to put it? Yeah, there's a very fundamental debate in the end, I think, between political science and econ, where the culture is more important in explaining not only populist voting, it's even older, right fringe voting, or whether it's economics. I think the empirical evidence from both fields indicate that it is both. So you have strong level differences between countries in whether populist parties manage to even enter the government, or whether they remain minority parties like in Germany with 10%. You have strong regional differences. That's very interesting to see in Germany, that do relate to cultural issues, that you still have Catholic milieus where people traditionally vote for the CDU and do not accept that democratic parties right of the CDU could ever exist. And you have other regions where people are more willing to also try out fringe parties and all this stuff. That's of course there. And this topic-wise, there is, of course, what Anke Hassel said, that there is this identity issues, that specific social group, white men of medium age with traditional values, fear losing their identity in a society that develops into a more open, multicultural development. Of course, this is all there, but this does not contradict the very fact that people are responsive to economic shocks. The question is, from economic perspective, I think economic research is more interested in the trend, not so much in the level differences. Why are the populists strong in the one region but not in the other? Economic research very much is into what drives the increase. Why do people change their voting behavior? And there it's obvious that people, if they face economic shocks. And interestingly, and I'm with Gustav Horn here, it's not so much, this is what our research clearly shows, that people individually have lost their job because their jobs have been outsourced. People are much more responsive to the economic development of their whole region. So even if they themselves are not affected at all by economic developments, if the region is in decline, this raises anxieties about the future and make people susceptible for this populist campaigning. And I think both, that's if you ask me about the state of the research, a lot of research now looks in exactly those interactions. So why is it that those regions that are in economic downturn, why is it that people there are so supportive of populist and nationalist policies? And this interacts with these issues. So I think both factors do not contradict each other. They go in hand. And specifically, there's also a supply side, and there you have to say that populist parties are particularly successful in addressing these fears and in providing a narrative that links economic hardship to anxieties, to identity issues, and provide a policy or promise a policy that is attractive to those exposed, and which is then a mixture of providing protection on the economic side, but also of promising more homogeneous cultural development for the future. I think this is my take from the current research, specifically from the empirical research on the issue.
This, by the way, a very interesting paper by Danny Roderick, published recently, is exploring or trying in a very modest, decent way to explore this difficulty to identify the core reasons and what is the second round effects in a way, and what you call supply. So that there are some parts, the core reasons may be different, maybe economic, but then parties exploit this fact in introducing whatever narratives or things to people that it's about immigration or whatever. Anke, is that your take also much that this is the state of the discussion, or what would you say is on the reasons of populism? Is there something which is more or less established today as a consensus?
I think what is established, if we just empirically, is that the average right-wing voter, far right-wing voter, is not the poorest voter. So, and in many analysis, we see that they have the average AfD voter has an average, above average pay, for instance, and above average wealth situation. So it's not really the working classes. And, you know, we discussed in the beginning of, you know, finalizing the AfD and the success of the AfD, we focused a lot on the lower middle, on the poor people in society, and thought this is a phenomenon that poor people sort of you know, hit back against the establishment. But we know it is not the poorest part of the of society who vote for the far right. We know it is more middle class people, and it is precisely because they have a lot to lose. I mean, people who do not have much to lose, they either not vote at all, or they vote on the left, or they vote even just mainstream conservative. But it is really people who have middle class positions and who have an economic position to lose, who go for the far right, and because they fear that they are not protected by current government policies against negative impacts of structural changes, and we know that there is an effect of that. In the political science literature, we have a long-standing discussion about cleavages that leads to voting decisions, and we have for a very long time have two dimensions, and one is the socioeconomic dimension, and that is the classic left-right dimension, you know, which divides the party spectrum between people on the left and the right, you know, one's more interested in redistribution and social equality, and one more interested in growth and liberal policies. But now, but also for, you know, at least 3 decades, we have a discussion about the second dimension, and the second dimension is on cultural orientations, and that is really divides the society between open and closed societies, or multicultural societies, or, you know, homogeneous societies. And the analysis there has focused recently really on when you sort of map out party systems, and that you find a movement within the party system of the more center-right parties who used to favor on the cultural dimension, who used to be much more clearly in the camp of protecting closed societies and being against multicultural societies. You know, if you think back, the CDU 10 years ago, it was not in favor of immigration, very clearly not in favor of immigration, and we had even election campaigns, regional election campaigns where representatives of the CDU said, we want our own population policies, we want to have a higher birth rates of Germans, and we don't want immigration. And the 2015, when we had an influx of a large number of refugees, you know, this hit the CDU as a party hard, because all of a sudden the whole position on immigration and the stance of on immigration just was lost and abandoned by Angela Merkel overnight, so to speak, because then in the aftermath of that, we had more of a discussion also of the CDU embracing immigration and dealing more constructively or openly with immigration. The effect is that we now, in the political party spectrum, we have no political party anymore who is really conservative in the sense that on the cultural and value basis, they opt for a more closed society. And the AfD is the only party in the party spectrum which has the position that they are in favor of a more closed society and are not really promoting an open society. And that just leaves an open a gap in the political competition, because all other parties are in favor of open societies, they have more positive views on immigration. They have moved along on gay rights, LGBT rights, you know, a whole set of postmodernist identity politics rights. And there is still a segment in society which doesn't go along with that, and which is much more conservative, culturally conservative, and does not have a home anymore. And that is a discussion, you know, if you think back a year ago or 2 years ago, when in Die Linke there was a discussion with Sarah Wagenknecht, who said, you know, we really, as a left-wing party, we have to adopt a position which is much more in favor of closed societies, and also has a much more anti-globalization stance, but also a stance which has a sort of view of controlled migration, and we have to reduce migration to some extent, or at least we have to look at it very carefully. So in the party spectrum, the AfD has an open space there, and it can occupy the space on the cultural value front, and that is what they do, and that is you know, where all parties have to battle with. And I think the lesson we can learn from countries like the United States and the degree of polarization in the United States is that socioeconomically, you know, social inequality has got way out of hand, is out of control in the United States. But the real problem is really on the cultural side and on the value side, so that Democrats cannot talk to Republicans anymore, and that there is actually no room for compromises anymore, has to do with polarization on values. And that is really dangerous. And we should really focus on this aspect and make sure that we do not get into a situation where the political and societal debate is so polarized that we cannot talk to other people who might have different positions when it comes to cultural values. We have to be more open and tolerant on cultural values, and we also have to make it possible that people who have more conservative cultural values are still represented in the party system and do not have to vote for AfD because they have certain positions on cultural values. I think that is a debate we need to have.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, because it's what very much defines German politics and the German debate in recent times, where it's always separate. It seems as if there's always already such a separation between those who say, well, this is can't be a problem, because if you say that it's a problem, we are telling the discourse of, or sharing what the AfD is telling. So
yeah, but that is precisely my point. I think that is, I mean, the AfD is sort of, you know, I'm really not in favor of discussing these issues with the AfD. I think the AfD is just, as a political party, is, you know, is an extreme party we should not really engage with. But we need to engage with perspectives and viewpoints which say we have to look at globalization. We have to look at, we also have to have an open discussion about migration. It must be possible to have an open discussion about migration. We have to allow for different points of view. And we cannot just cancel people, or we cannot just oppress certain opinions because we don't like them. We say, you know, this is the opinion of the AfD. I think we need to have this discussion.
Maybe it's also about telling a little different story, because it's, as you say, about globalization. It's not, maybe it's not about Islam or whatever. You know, that's what is exploited as a threat and something which is very overdone. But on the other side, and that's, I just wanted to don't know if you have followed the discussion I had with Jens Spahn on Monday evening. It's really interesting, because he's trying to explore and to go in that way, and to better understand also economic disruptions and so on. That's interesting. In his way, it's a very different way, but he's also talking about how at one point, I mean, it's interesting to see where you can find common points with people like Jens Spahn from conservative side, talking about globalization, where he's having in mind more this perspective that you mentioned of people who, well, need or have a more attracted by this cultural side, and if you join both, you know, you construct a better globalization in an economic sense. It may also help to avoid this. So maybe there are touching points. There are points where both the cultural and the economic side are going together. Just wanted to quote the excellent study of Timo Fetzer, who has wanted to join but who can't join for private reasons this morning, this session, who has done an excellent paper and published in the American Economic Review on the reasons for Brexit vote, which is extremely interesting, exploring the double impact of austerity and structural shifts and in this old industrial regions, which is very fruitful, very, very interesting, and leads to the question that Gustav has also already raised. Apparently, austerity does also play a role. It's maybe both. It's the perspective of region plus some austerity, which is seen as some injustice, and that's something we may come back to. I wanted to just have, maybe it helps to better understand, to raise the question. Perhaps, Gustav, you can say something about what you think. Why is it? It's interesting that IFD and others have lost this year in a situation which was a crisis situation. And, you know, people tend to say, well, it's always in crisis situations that the government, well, it has not been the case in 2015. So it's not evident that in a crisis situation, governments profit from that. But do you have an idea of why they lose?
Well, let me first say some words on the issue of culture and economics, because I think it's a kind of complicated relationship, because you find correlation certainly for both on the voting behavior. I won't object that, but sometimes I interpret these results in the following way, that the cultural issues are sometimes the scapegoats for adverse economic effects. You can say that, for example, when you look at the anti-migration issue, the AfD got many successes in the voting behavior, telling people, these migrants come here to Germany and take away your jobs and your social security. And these people have never paid taxes in Germany, they have never worked in Germany, so they have, and so they don't earn it. And this certainly links then migration, a cultural issue, strange people coming to Germany and taking away your money. That's a basic story they told, and they had successes on that with people who were afraid of their economic status, and that's totally plausible. So both certainly play a role. Also with the rise of the economic share of women. Some people are afraid of that. Some women are afraid of losing their jobs because women now want their job. That's a story the AfD tells sometimes. So we have an interconnection between those two issues. But in the end, it's certainly that the economic fears are certainly something which is very, very important. But you asked me, why is the AfD not so successful this year compared to 2015? Because we had that two crises, but the decision taken in this crisis were totally different. In 2015, the decision of the government was to let the migrants in. That was a decision that increased insecurity. In this crisis, there was insecurity coming from outside by the virus, but the government's decision on economic issues were decisions that reduced insecurity by giving a lot of money to support firms, by giving short-time working money to the employees. And that were all measures to reduce insecurity. And that was the basic aim of the government in all these discussions. We have to give the money very fast to the people and to the firms so that insecurity will not rise during these very difficult times. And the government was successful with that. And by doing so, the AfD and other populists had no reason to complain. And that certainly made the difference in the perception of the situation. And that certainly is a lesson we have to follow in the future. As soon as the crisis is over, and as soon as those would prevail in the political debate that say, now we have to be very, very frugal in our economic policy, then populism will rise again, I would say. And we have seen during the budget debate yesterday, and this will continue today, I suppose, that some people go already in that direction. And that is something I see with great concern.
I mean, I more or less share the diagnosis. Still, it's a little puzzling because, you know, compared to the situation before before Corona, jobs were much more secure. than they are now. I mean, there are a lot of people on short time and so on. So
yes, but
compared to
this was a security which was not perceived as a result of government policies, but the economic situation was good. We were in a kind of boom. So people did not think about much about the job insecurity. They thought about other things. And when the pandemic came, everybody saw that their jobs was at stake, closing down firms and a lot. And then the government stepped in and said, no, don't worry, we're doing something against that. And that certainly increased security there. It's a feeling, it's a fear of losing a job, which is decisive, not that they'll really lose a job.
Robert, you raised your hand.
Yeah, if I may add just one or two thoughts on that. So the first is, and there's a nice recent study by Christoph Trebesch and others clearly showing this pandemics gives momentum to governments. Yeah, so there is a huge challenge and the government has to act and react. And this always leads to some rally around the flag effect, first and foremost. Yeah, so big social challenge, the government acts, this gives momentum to the government. And then it's very decisive how the government reacts. And populists really underperformed in this respect. So the handling of the pandemics is a disaster in the US and in the UK. Strange enough, this does not really lead to the populist base reacting in a way of decreasing support for the government, but surely it shows to everybody else that the whole populist approach is perhaps not the populist approach to politics is not the best when it comes to tackling real issues. And I think what went well in Germany is I'm very much with Gustav that the government sent out this signal that it is willing to provide security. So you cannot blame the government for a natural disaster, and you cannot blame the government for the pandemics. So I think this is something that people understand. This also goes into the direction of Roderick's argument that people understand that that some developments cause insecurities. The question is, how do you address it? And the German government very successfully managed to provide this security. But I think the government, it was also an example of good policy communication. And this goes into the direction what Anke Hassel said. So how do you bring the message across? How do you organize support for your policies? And I think one important factor here was that there was a broad debate amongst the federal government and the state governments how to react to this crisis. This was a very public debate. This gave people the impression, okay, these people really care about what to do. They look for the best solution. There is some democratic process involved in finding a solution. They were very transparent in communicating their policy, and I think this contributed a lot to securing also the acceptance of a policy that is in the end very unpopular. And it was accompanied, and this is something which I find very interesting, by very successful communication by scientific experts. So I think it is a very, very good example how the virologists in a language that everybody could understand explained what was happening. They were very transparent also in what they knew, what they just suspected, what they did not know. And in the very end, this really helped to have a fact-based discussion on how to deal with a broad challenge, which also counters the approach. I have very much the UK in mind, and it's a pity that Timo is not here, where the whole discussion is in the end on the basis of bluster and misinformation. And in the US, people selling I've done everything I could to handle this pandemics, and and just talking nonsense. It was a very, very good example how to lead a discussion on the basis of facts. And I think we as economists can learn a lot from what the virologist did in here, and I hope that in general there might be some lessons learned how to tackle this fake news approach that populist parties have. So apparently it's possible to bring in facts into a political discussion, have an open, transparent discussion, and act on the basis of that. And yeah, I think this was successful and may also have contributed to the fact that the AfD could not gain here in the crisis, because the policy it was good policy design, but it was also a very good debate on this policy.
Anke, you want to tell? Anke?
Yeah, first of all, I agree. Just one slight note on the UK, you know, because I mean, on the pandemic, I agree. But if you look at the economic policies of the UK, and if you look at the introduction of the job retention scheme, this was a big success in the UK policymaking, because, you know, it has a liberal labour market in the UK. You know, they never had a policy like that. They never even had the idea that you should keep people in jobs which are not viable anymore. And the whole, like in the US, the British labour market is really is based on flexibility and on movement, and that the UK government, within really a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, invented and introduced a job retention scheme, which is very similar, to some extent similar, to the German short-term working scheme. Is a huge success, and is something you would not really expect from a populist government. And, you know, and then you compare it to what the US has done on these kinds of issues, you know, and you know that the US completely failed on introducing a similar scheme, even though they tried. So I think you have to give something to the UK government machinery, that they can also respond to a policy challenge, and they could do so in the job retention scheme, and they failed on the health side, which is an interesting puzzle, and one needs to look into that more closely. But what I wanted to say about the German response to the crisis is, I agree with that the approach the government took was a very measured approach, and it was very open towards experts, and it was evidence-based, and they tried to include as much evidence as possible. And I think that should become a role model for future policymaking, really to integrate people who know the substance of the policy field very carefully, and include them in the decision making. I think that is important. And what we see now, and that is the interesting part of it, is that the discussion is now shifting from the health aspect to the socioeconomic aspect, and focusing on schools and higher education and education policies. And, you know, if you listen to Angela Merkel in the last week, she said, you know, we really want to prevent another lockdown, and we really want to focus on keeping schools open. And the whole school debate, you know, has showed so many weaknesses of the German education system, and the investments that are now made available to invest in digital equipment of schools, you know, also shows that this is also a great opportunity. I mean, if the pandemic would help us to really modernize the school system and the education system, this would be a huge asset. And if we can manage to do it in a similar way to the earlier responses, that we include experts, we really take seriously people who know about how a good school education system might work, you know, what you have to focus on, what you have to keep in mind, etc. This would be a massive opportunity. And I also agree that might help us to keep the AfD at bay, because it delivers services to people who they eventually will appreciate as well. So good governance is always a good way of fighting the far right. I completely agree.
Okay. Gustav.
Yes, let me first, from a kind of insider position, confirm what Robert and Anke said. I've never seen, in the several crises I had the opportunity to live through in the German economy, seen such an open discussion as in this crisis. Every Thursday, many economists gathered around the finance minister, and there was a very open-minded discussion. And And this I haven't seen in previous crises. For example, 10 years ago, 12 years ago in the financial market crisis, we had very fierce debates among economists about how the government should react on the financial market crisis. And there was a lot of disagreement among economists. And this is not the case this time. The policies now applied would have been by many economists fundamentally rejected in 2008 and 2009. This has totally changed. The discussion were much more open-minded. The government was much more open-minded than it was at that time. And it applied a strategy which is also to some extent new. For example, on the federal level, in this crisis, we had much less investment into infrastructure and so on than in the financial market crisis. But what was done was that a lot of money is going to be shifted to the regional and local level. So that, for example, local authorities are now in a position to increase their investment significantly. Being now a chairman of a financial means committee on a local level, I know that our budget position as a local authority has improved actually during this crisis, because we get much more money now to do our investment than we had before. And that's a good strategy in this crisis, because many of the concerns raised by the populists were of local nature. There was a street which was totally disrupted in a way and not repaired because there was no money available. This can be changed right now. And it is connected with the idea of transforming our economy. At the school level now, we have just got a lot of money to buy tablets for all those pupils who have not the money to buy them. We can give to every pupil now some kind of digital equipment so that they can share a digital learning now. So, and this is something which was impossible throughout the last years. Now it is possible. So we transform. And also we have a lot of investment into ecological issues now. We are transforming our economy, we're transforming our society in this crisis to get out stronger than we got in. But let me raise one point which has not yet been discussed to a certain extent. The point is information. We live in a totally different environment than 10 years ago as far as information is concerned. Many people inform themselves, get the news out of social media. And we know that this is can be a very dangerous thing, because the algorithm lead you to news in a way which will confirm your views in a way and increase polarization in our society. We have seen that during this crisis to a large extent, when people cited sources to prove that the virus is not dangerous, from some mediciners who have never published on that, who have never had thought on that, but made a video on YouTube, and this is cited as a reliable source. And this is provided to them by the algorithm because they have clicked on these kind of news all the time. And this certainly increases the rift, the cleavage in the society more and more. And this is something what has happened in the United States to a very large extent. I'm still shocked by the presidential debate last night, because these two candidates actually couldn't talk to each other. And that's something that reflects what's happening among people in the United States too. Many people can't talk to each other anymore. And that is based on a totally different perception of reality by these people. And this certainly is enhanced by the way social media and their algorithm functions. And we have to address this problem of information and fake news much more severely, because it certainly is a very big obstacle to reasonable politics.
Sorry, it was
Thomas has vanished.
Good point. I wanted to challenge still, coming back to Gustav, still challenge this view a little bit. I mean, the SPD has been, if it's about socioeconomic factors, if it's about insecurity, if it's about all these things, the least that we can say is that the SPD has done a lot of things in the last few years in this coalition, introducing minimum wage and having a lot of social instruments that reduce or should reduce sort of social insecurity. Still, the SPD is not really gaining, if to be modest, or to put it modestly. To the contrary, why is it? I mean, if maybe the diagnosis is wrong, why does the SPD don't profit from all this?
Well, in terms of traditional political criteria, the SPD has been very successful. You're absolutely right. If I look back what has been achieved, but what is being achieved still in this grand coalition. But in terms of providing the information that the SPD has been successful, the SPD is remarkably unsuccessful. And for example, I'm still very astonished that the big strategist fighting the coronavirus on the regional level in Germany is Markus Söder, which has the worst figures as far as infections are concerned. But he is present in the media. He is perceived as somebody who has ideas and who tells the ideas to the general public. And who of the Social Democratic prime minister, local regional prime minister, is perceived as such a strategist? So although there are much better figures in their regions, I can't see one, and that happens to many people now in leading positions in the Social Democratic. They don't come over in this new information environment, and that's something the SPD has to work on very severely during the next months in order to be successful in the next federal elections.
I would like to just know what you think. I would have maybe another potential explanation, just that people are, yes, they need sort of things like a minimum wage or something which protects them in a very difficult situation, but that's not what people aspire to. It's more they want to have a perspective and a good job and grow and so on. And it's good to have a protection net, but that's perhaps not enough. It's what people are missing is that perspective. And I'm in that sense always thinking about the sociologues' analysis. Some of them, like comparing to the after-war period where everyone was going up and the escalator theme. And this is not the case anymore. So if that's the case, it's not enough to just have social policies or protection. Maybe because you have taken a lot of time, I'm playing the presidential. So I have given the word to Anke and Robert now.
Yeah, I think that is a debate the SPD must engage in, and I would be more on the side of Thomas than of Gustav to say, and it is a heated debate within the party. To what extent should the party really focus on social policies, on really focus on the left behinds, or whether they should focus on the aspiring middle classes? And this is the debate we already had when we talked about New Labour, when we talked about Gerhard Schröder, when we talked about the Neue Mitte. The Neue Mitte approach by Gerhard Schröder was exactly that we have to focus on those lower middle classes who are interested in upward social mobility, and we have to give them a scenario and a plan of how we can support them, if they want to have a career in their lives. And we know how the reforms of Gerhard Schröder backfired for the party. We can discuss how they backfired, what they meant for the country, but we definitely know, and we probably share, that they backfired for the party. And it introduced a cleavage and a fundamental conflict within the party between those who said, we are really a party which believes in social equality, and we focus on protecting the socially weak part of society, and those who said we need sound economic policies and we need to focus on people who are in the middle class or lower middle class and have upward aspirations. I think that is the discussion we had. And from my perspective, the party needs to do both. And in the last 5 to 10 years haven't really solved this issue and have not really developed the policies which also give a reason to those voters to vote for them who don't think we need protection, who are not interested in another yet debate on social assistance and Hartz-IV, and is Hartz-IV right or wrong, and do we need sanctions, yes or no, who think this is really a crucial policy decision. I think the crucial policy decision is really to provide good public services to people, to provide good schools to people, to have good universities, to have a good health system, and to help people to navigate their lives more successfully. I think that would be an area where I would think the SPD has to do more and has to deliver more, and then combine it with the right people, and then I think they have more of an electoral chance in the next election. That would be my take on your question.
Okay, Robert from.
I don't know much about the optimal strategy for the SPD, apart from the very fact that they have a problem in the very end in defining who their core electorate actually is, because the traditional blue collar worker in the end does not really exist anymore in Germany. And where to go? Yeah, that's a difficult question. Luckily, it's up to SPD leaders to decide where to go. I mean, the other aspect is, why don't they bring their successes across? Because as Gustav said, and this was already a problem in the last Grand Coalition and discussed afterwards a lot, that the SPD managed, although they are the junior partner in the Grand Coalition, to do a lot of SPD politics, but somehow they don't get the message across. How successful they are in realizing parts of their agenda. And that's something, well, sure. I mean, the whole social media bubble is problematic there, but it's also due to the sender to deal with that. So it's I think others have been much more successful in developing strategies to address people via social media, to use new communication channels. It's certainly not easy. I agree that's super important to do that, because I mean, every economic model at the core, every microeconomic model at the core, has a well-informed economic subject making autonomous decision to increase his or her own benefit. But at the core of it is processing information in a meaningful and reliable way. And you see that populists are very successful in social media, and are very successful in spreading those fake news. And this in the end makes it, of course, impossible for people to make well-informed decisions if they rely on this information. I mean, that's very obvious in the UK, that the Brexiteers, the Leave voters, they are convinced that it is a good idea to leave the European Union with no deal, and it will grant them economic benefits. So based on obvious misinformation, they make a decision that I cannot imagine that they would have made the same decision if they had processed reliable news. So I think it's a big challenge to indeed counter this misinformation. It seems as if the SPD was not so super successful in their communication strategies here, if they don't even manage to bring their own message across. But how to do that? Well, yeah, that's challenging.
Maybe just because it's one of our leading topics in the last, or has been for the forum, this idea of a paradigm. I think that may help to explain, but just an idea. It may be more than just having a couple of, or the sum of some measures, you know. And in communication, I mean, people have understood that there's been a minimum wage introduced and so on. So it's, in a way, the instruments in itself are communicated, are there, and so on. But maybe it's much more about a new storytelling, I mean, it's not only, it's not this alone, it's not the storytelling alone, but it's a whole idea of what is driving economic policy or social policies, what is our leading principle. And that's, I mean, the basic of our forum is to say there has been such a very strong paradigm in the past, and Gustav, you're describing it in your book also, which has been simple. And you know, since Reagan and Thatcher and so on, they had their story, and that was simple, and it was very strong guiding policies from the Washington Consensus to the European Union and so on. This is, I think, is there something like a new paradigm that is arising, or is that maybe the problem? I mean, it's more than just having some measures. It's that story, that paradigm, that guiding line for policies. Gustav, perhaps you wanted to.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's one thing: the SPD was way too slow. The SPD was too slow to accept a new paradigm. The SPD should have done that 10, 12 years ago, because at that financial market crisis, that was a point where it became obvious that the old paradigm was dysfunctional in a way. And that could have been a point of policy change in the Social Democratic Party. It hasn't been. They made a lot of measures which went into another direction, but after the crisis was over, they went back to the old strategy, defending, for example, the debt brake and all that stuff, austerity policy, die Schwarze Null, and all that stuff was defended by the SPD, and thereby the SPD was identified with the old paradigm rather than a new paradigm. And that was wrong in my view. And on the other hand, I think we are some steps further than Anke says. It is absolutely consensus now, at least the leading parts of the SPD, that we need a sound economic policy with an investment strategy on a local level to bring local authorities further, to raise the standard of living on a local and regional level. And all this is consensus at the party, but and the debates about the benefits of Hartz IV or not, this debate is finished within the party, at least since last year, when there was a decision being made how to reform Hartz IV, if the SPD could do it. And we move on, but we have not yet succeeded. We have not yet succeeded in creating the impression and creating the story of this change in the SPD to a general public. And that's something we have to work on. That's absolutely right. We have now a paradigm shift in the SPD, late, very late, but we have it now. And that is reflected in the decisions which have been taken during the crisis. There was no debate whether there be a stimulus package or not. It was accepted right from the beginning, there has to be a stimulus package. We just discussed how it should be constructed and which measures should be included and which not. But the fundamental debate was over. It was quite clear. Neoliberalism was not a measure that should be taken right now. And the SPD was certainly the party in the government which was driving this change. And Angela Merkel, she's a very pragmatic person. She saw the SPD has some recipe against this crisis, so let's do it. And in the end, it was her benefit. So, but that will change next year, as Anke already told. Angela Merkel will no longer be chancellor next year. And let's see what happens then in the Christian Democrats, and if the Christian Democrats will credibly go on with this pragmatic course Angela Merkel has. And that will be the decisive point, whether the Christian Democrats will really be the strongest party after the election.
Okay. I would like to bring in Tore from our team. I would like to.
Yes. Hi, Gustav. My question would go to you, as I'm also a member of the SPD. I think it is very important how we define the audience of the SPD and how we to whom we have to talk. And in recent years, we saw developments, especially in the trade unions, who were supposed to be the target audience of the SPD. In how far, but we saw some evidence that the AfD got very strong, especially in the IG Metall, and I see some kind of discrepancy between the social science and economic science departments of the IMK, for example, and the research departments, and the actual people who are in the trade unions. And my question would be, how can we address these people who are kind of fearing the change of the new paradigm? but as a party or a trade union, you accepted the paradigm shift. But how do we communicate this to the core audience of the party?
That is certainly one very important task. We have seen that during this crisis already, this rift. It was the debate about some subsidies on the combustion vehicles, and the government refused to do so, and rightly refused to do so, and the trade unions were very much annoyed about that. And I think that exactly describes now where we have to discuss. The Social Democrats want the society to change, want the economy to change, because we have to meet the challenges of digitalization and a more sustainable way of production, but without losing many jobs. So what we have to do is we have to tell people, yes, you have to change. And you have to change by doing more investment in changing production structures, for example. And this is something which we will support. We will not support the present structures. We will not support the status quo, but we will support the change. The change within, you can preserve your jobs for some time. We give you money to do this investment. We give you any support to keep the jobs. We give you any support to qualify people for the new kind of jobs, but we don't give you money to produce the same goods you have produced during the recent decades. And that's the message we have given to the trade unions. And after an initial phase of being very annoyed, especially in the IG Metall, they're now slowly accept this course and use the chances which are coming with this course, and use the investment means they're getting with this course. And I think this is a kind of difficult times between the Social Democrats and the trade unions, but it's a time of discussion, of limited conflict, and we have to find a new common basis to go into the future. But I don't see that we should simply be the party which just preserving existing structures at the expense of meeting the challenging of digitalization and sustainable production. That can't be a successful way, can't maybe successful temporarily, but certainly not in the longer future.
Okay, thank you. Just to say that we're not only talking about the SPD. The interesting thing is that you see any parallels, some parallels in other parties. I mentioned to talk with Jens Spahn, who's picking up some of these ideas of how to redesign globalization, how to be more social, and so on. There is in the FDP even are people who are thinking about trying of a more inclusive liberalism. I think that's a challenge which goes beyond party structures and parties to cope with these new challenges. And the interesting thing is also to talk about the next party, or the other party, important party now, the Greens, which is, well, it has been interesting to see how they lost in the pandemic. I mean, how fast they lost in the pandemic. Maybe it's also a sign of they have a very, very good point in climate. And it's now the big challenge, and everyone sees, and that's maybe why they are having a good point there, and why they are very strong and still strong. But maybe the pandemic also showed that that's maybe not enough in long term. There's something different that people want. I would like to ask Mark. You had a very interesting question on Mark Adam on Zoom already. Maybe you can put it short and introduce your thing.
Yeah, I will try. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. My question, what we didn't talk about, was sort of the banking sector, the financial system. And there has been a lot of research about private fueled debt booms. And then there's a financial crisis and there's debt overhang. And there has been some research done that financial crisis can be linked to populism. And basically, I'm wondering if maybe there is a debt crisis right now looming, and if we might face populism from that angle. And maybe not this time, but I would say that the regulation of the financial system is far from over, and that if not in this crisis, we might face populism from that angle as well. maybe one reason why we fared well through that crisis is because of the KfW, and you had loans to small enterprises to weather the crisis at the moment. But maybe also not everything is going well with those loans. And I'm wondering if fiscal policy, I mean, of course, you don't want to have austerity and you need to respond to a crisis, but in the very short run, in a financial crisis, it's very hard to gegensteuern at, as Gustav once said, I would say, I would imagine, I don't know, I'm wondering what your opinion is.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask Anke one thing, and we can come back to that point immediately. But as we are talking about the social and economic effects, and as political scientists, one striking fact is among populism in Germany, especially the AfD, is that they don't really exploit this point. I mean, they are not, I mean, they're talking about nation, about immigrants and so on, but they're not exploring this or exploiting this social economic things. So they are, and that's the difference to, for example, the right wing in France or in Italy, where they are very offensively, very directly, also addressing these social issues. And I mean, that's, we know as Germans, that's the historically the very very dangerous mix. I mean, that's what the Nazis have done, you know, bring both parts together. What is your take on that? I mean, the AfD fundamentally is in economic terms more a neoliberal, market liberal party. I mean, isn't that the danger at some point? And people have talked about that. So at some points in the East, they are trying to explore to go this way. Would that be the big danger if they see themselves as the party that are not only defending national culture, but also people and socially and economic terms?
So the AfD, I think for the AfD, the point when they realized that it wouldn't be easy for them is when they started to work on a pension reform. And, you know, in the last year, the AfD tried to propose a pension reform, and they ended up with sort of pensions for Germans as the key sort of slogan, that they want to have better pensions for Germans than compared to non-Germans. I think the reason why the AfD is not going for social issues is because we already have three parties on the left who focus a lot on social issues, and electorally they would not make major inroads if they started to compete on social issues with parties like Die Linke or the SPD and even the Green Party, because they're very strong on social policy. I think for them it is a deliberate choice that they basically have given up on this and realized that they cannot really compete on that. And plus the whole history of the AfD is different from the history of many other populist parties in Europe, because they come from economists. I mean, economists set up the AfD, and von Lucke, you know, was the first chairman, and the whole sort of Euro history of the AfD also gives them a much more neoclassical, neoliberal leaning, which does not lend itself easily to going to the other side and say, you know, we make a major point on campaigning on social issues. I think that would be my two parts of the explanation why the AfD is very reluctant in engaging and having a much stronger social profile. But I would like to come back to what you said earlier about the paradigms, because that is what you're working on the new paradigms. And I find it actually very interesting to see where is the new economic paradigm, and how are different governments or different countries embracing this discussion. Because when we look at the populist government in the US, we see that the paradigm, the economic paradigm of Trump is America first. And that is a very clear statement, and it has very clear economic implications to do with protectionism, but also to do with industrial policies. And And it is a very clear signal. And to some extent, if you look at Johnson in the UK, he is also not a Thatcherite in economic policies. He is not, and he's thinking of how to develop the north of England, how to have policies that have more regional components, etc. So I think he is not someone who's really a neoliberal in economic terms. So they are setting, the populists setting an economic agenda. And the economic agenda of the non-populists, or the only one I can see at the moment, is the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal is nothing you can really campaign on, or it is very hard to campaign on the Green New Deal because it is so focused on a very specific perspective on the climate crisis and the green transition. So I think there is an opportunity, but also a need for centrist parties to really think hard about the new economic paradigm. And we know, the role of the state has become much more important through the pandemic. The government is now much more involved in many areas of economic activity. It's propping up businesses. We are investing heavily in companies, but also bailing out companies, but also in short-term working. But this needs a sort of more coherent concept, and it needs a more coherent message. What is actually the government, a centrist government? What are they trying to do, and what is the economic message? So I think we still have work to do on developing a new economic paradigm, which is sort of simple enough for people to understand what it means, and what the implications are in sort of compared to the America first or UK first or France first, and how can we develop it, and what are the cornerstones of this concept? I think there is still a lot to discuss.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I think we have still a lot to do. And I want to attract, because Gustav talked about the role of the financial crisis, want to attract on attention again on the very smart and short and first rough presentation that we will do in a couple of minutes on the role of buzzwords. That's really striking. At least ex post, so for the past, and it shows how much these words are, how important they are, and they are reflecting what you say, a coherent new storytelling. And it was, I listened to that part of the debate last night. It was really striking, and it was a very bad moment when Trump tried to say, well, you are the guy who is defending the Green New Deal. And instead of saying, yes, I'm doing, in the American context, as he has pushed him, so, it's seen as something leftist, and he's very much working on that. And Joe Biden tries to not be leftist. And so on. And at one point, Joe Biden said, no, I'm not for the Green New Deal, very explicitly. So it was like, yeah, okay, what are you for? What is the story that you're telling in economic terms? The Democrats are trying just to avoid Trump and not to tell the new story. But that has shown how much, even in the US, the Democrats don't have such a new concept, and at least not a consensus about such a new concept. We have 5 minutes left. I would just like to come back to the question, the very concrete question on the next couple of months and next year. In December 2021, so in 1 year, maybe more or less the day, I don't know if the date is fixed already, there will be the federal elections. So we had a consensus about saying, well, it's not over, there are more fundamental reasons, but what about the next month? Is there a chance that, a chance for us, for people who don't want the AfD to gain, that they will keep at that level, stay at that level, so lose very much compared to last time? Or is there a risk, like Gustav, you said, that if the discussion starts about austerity, that the opposite will happen? Maybe that's too short as an impact, but I would like to have a short take on that. Perhaps Gustav, you can, with a forecast of how much the AfD will have in September 2021, just as a small game.
Well, it's very difficult to forecast election results these days. But I would say that there's a good chance that they will have that they will stay in the one, but will be reduced to the one-digit figures, because the time is too short. I think that all this neoliberal paradigm will be restored within due time to the election. There is a danger, for example, if the Christian Democrats elect Friedrich Merz as their leader and as a candidate for chancellery, then there may be indeed such a kind of policy strategy, and then I would have to revise my forecast, I would say, and there will be into double-digit figures. But if things move another way, I would say they will stay in the one-digit figures. Because all the other parties will provide some sort of impression that people will be secure despite the crisis, and that they will continue with that kind of policy. And so I'm slightly optimistic that we might reduce them to some extent. But it's like with the virus; they're still there, and there may be other times when we are less resilient. And in the question we have been by Mark, it came up, for example, this time it was not the financial sector, but still we are far away from a secure financial sector. The regulation is way away from a point where I would say this is a stable financial sector. And if you look at the difficulties of introducing, for example, a financial transaction tax, we see that resistance is still very, very strong. And there may be another time when the next crisis comes again from the financial sector, and then we have to say, there we are again. And so nothing is totally safe at the moment, but we have a good chance.
Okay, maybe passing to Anke, I may add or make it more exciting, saying, I mean, very much will depend evidently on the coming winter and Corona. Maybe just as a more negative idea, if Corona gets out of control, that's maybe not happening. But if the government loses this image of having things under control, maybe then the situation will be very different. If the diagnosis is right that you did at the beginning, that this feeling of the government is doing the right thing has helped. So and avoided the AfD to gain. Anke, what is your forecast?
I think we really don't know. I would really say, the future is so open at the moment, and so many things can happen in various directions. And if your scenario would take place, that Corona is out of control, we sort of get a French scenario or an Italian scenario of the spring. Would that lead to more support of the AfD? I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think, if we look back on what happened in March and April, and the discussion was very much on the health system, on the intensive care, on death rates, etc. I think the focus will be a lot on the executive, and a time of crisis is always a time of the executive. I don't think that would help the AfD. I think the danger in terms of populism is really more in the medium term, after the election, after when short-term working runs out as policy, when people lose their jobs, when there is a massive restructuring in manufacturing industries, but also in other companies that cannot continue, where the business model doesn't work anymore, etc., etc. So when economic insecurity really hit, it's not the pandemic as such that will drive the AfD or potential votes for the AfD, but it's really an increase in economic insecurity, which is most likely to take place next year after the election and not before.
Thank you. Robert.
Well, I also think that the AfD will stay below 10%. I don't think that the AfD has good strategic options at the very moment. They try a little bit to establish themselves as an anti-EU party, but this does not ring well with the German voters, I think, because the EU has strong support in Germany. They try out aligning with those anti-pandemic measures, this anti-vaccinists and so, but this might even cost them a part of the core voters, which are not, some of them are very much in favor with the measures in place. So in the very end, I think all they have left is the anti-immigration platform. They will mobilize voters that are attracted by that, and that's it. But as Mark said, the next crisis is there to come. Interestingly, I looked a little bit into the data in regional exposure to the financial crisis, where you regions where many insolvencies increased a lot in 2009 in reaction to the crisis, and we had a lot of applications to the furlong scheme. And these regions, it's not necessarily the AfD that benefited, but it's the far right nationalist parties, NPD and parties like that. This is, if you, I'm not so much interested in the AfD per se, but in this underlying voting potential, which is bigger. And there I think, of course, this is the next crisis, if it is not countered by the right policy measures, will increase the voting potential for parties and candidates that have a very nationalistic stance. I think, last sentence, indeed, that a good paradigm might help. I think it would be helpful if the executive, if the established parties could more transparently communicate what this is all there for. So why do we negotiate free trade agreements? Why do we invest into furthering economic integration? So under Erhard, it was welfare for all. That's a good statement. That's something what people can understand. Now it's very much about technical details. Why do we support the banking sector? Why do we have quantitative easing? So there's no good answer to that. I think it would be very helpful to have a statement like that. I don't know what it in the moment would be, security for all and welfare for some, or so. It does not ring that well. So I think, of course, one has also to carefully think about policy. But I think one should explain economic policies better in a way what they contribute indeed to aggregate welfare. But it's not only about communication and strategic campaigning. I think, of course, it also has to be accompanied by effective and credible policies to deliver on these promises. And yeah, I think we have made some progress in this respect over the last couple of months.
If it's been to be a little polemic in the German context, if it's just about marketing and charisma and so on, the FDP would be much stronger with a very smart man like Christian Lindner. But apparently, it's not only about that. It needs the core. And then we need to say, I mean, the FDP is particularly lost in a period where market liberalism has lost, and it's a very deep crisis of credibility. But it touches all the other parties, and we talked about Merkel. The CDU is maybe essentially keeping their level because of Merkel, and behind it doesn't seem as if there's a real clear vision of what's coming up. So I think we're in the midst of a very interesting debate, and just to mention this again, Robert, you're in the midst of this academic research. It's a quite recent field, and if you start from that, it's we need to say, and I think it's you're modest, I know you, and to say, well, we're in the midst of exploring that and of better understanding what is happening and why are people voting for extremist parties. And we have done, if I may say, you have done, and a lot of colleagues have done a lot of progress in the last couple of years. But I think it's still not 100% clear what it is and what to do. And it's being clear in the discussion also, and it's a way and on a search that we are on, and that's interesting. I mean, it's very important because there's much at stake if we don't stop populism. But it's interesting to follow and intellectually anyway, and to listen to all your thoughts. That is very inspiring. So thanks a lot for joining this panel and this discussion. We had already sessions on populism where Robert and others have presented papers, and we will have another panels for sure, because that's one of our guiding interests to combine this vacuum of paradigmatic vacuum, the link between this paradigmatic and populism, which is very much at the core of our problems today. So thanks a lot, and yeah, hopefully we see all soon back. We were very happy to see a lot of people in real yesterday. Today we are in a virtual mode, and it has been functioning again and very well. So thank you, and stay tuned.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure. See you.
I would say let's have